I've got another game given to me for free to review, this time by publisher No Gravity Games and developer Fat Gem. It's called Primal Light, and this one's not too bad. It's very rough around the edges, it takes getting used to, but I see what they were going for and I respect the effort. I'm not going to give it a wholehearted recommendation because it's got a lot of problems, but it might not be such a bad game to try out if you can get it for real cheap. The story is, well, it'll probably be easier and faster just to show you. Yep, that's it. Then you talk to this guy who explains that an evil god is being a real jerk and you have to go kick his butt. That's all there is to it. And you know what? I like games that get going right away. The presentation is pretty solid. It's a good looking game overall. Far from the best, but you can see a lot of details in the background. I'm surprised that it's not more distracting. There can be a lot going on back there, but it doesn't get in the way of the foreground. So in that sense, they did a great job with that. Level 8 is especially crazy looking. You're in some fleshy hellscape. I like how the doors and ceilings have these molars. It's really gross. The character animations are okay. Like, they're not bad, but they just repeat the same movements on a short loop, and aside from briefly flashing white, they don't react to getting hit at all, which is very jarring. I'll go into more detail on that later because it's a really big problem that this game has. The music is pretty good too. Every level and each individual boss has its own theme, and all of it sounds nice. None of this is particularly outstanding, but as far as the presentation goes, the game is just above average, which is certainly a good thing. On to the gameplay, and as you can tell, it's a pretty basic 2D platformer with simple combat. Maybe a little too simple. You only have the one attack for the entire game, some kind of sword slash. You can attack while crouching, you can attack vertically above you, and you can attack while jumping. But that's it. There's no special moves, no projectile attack, no power-ups or items. There isn't even a combo animation for pressing the attack button multiple times. It really is as basic as you can get. Now, I'm usually one who appreciates simple games, but in the case of Primal Light, I think there's a lack of depth here, and I would have liked to see something more. There is a dodge roll, although I've never found a safe time to use it. I'm actually not even sure if it has any invulnerability frames at all. It seems very useless and pointless, but I'm sure it was included to make this feel like it was supposed to be Dark Souls inspired. There's a button dedicated to healing yourself with a limited number of uses. Bonfires are used to signify checkpoints. The story is as bare bones as possible, and the world as a whole has a very dreary, almost post-apocalyptic feel to it. There's even an emphasis on playing the game multiple times, with each new game plus increasing in difficulty. I'm not saying that it plays anything like Dark Souls, but that's clearly the mood that they were going for. Along with your combat options being way too basic, the enemy's actions and reactions, or lack thereof, is very disappointing. Whenever you attack an enemy, they don't momentarily freeze in place or get knocked back a little or react in any way at all. They briefly flash white to signify that you landed the attack, but otherwise they'll just keep doing their thing with no pause whatsoever. Compare this to some good games in the action platformer genre. In Super Ghouls and Ghosts, attacking an enemy causes a brief period of hit stun, allowing you to safely continue attacking it. It might not seem like much, but it can really make a big difference. Castlevania does this too, briefly stopping the enemy in their tracks. It doesn't matter how difficult or how easy a game is, this is all about having satisfying feedback behind your actions, which is why you see it in even the Kirby games as well. This aspect isn't quite as emphasized in the Mega Man games, but it is important to note that those games have a greater focus on high mobility and ranged attacks, two things which are missing from Primal Light. Because your attack has a short range and you take damage from enemies walking into you, you have to rely on hit and run tactics in order to play it safe, which stretches out the fights for longer than what feels necessary, and it gets old very quickly. There are very few exceptions, notably the lighter, weaker enemies will get pushed back upon getting hit, but the vast majority of enemies do not react at all. Simply put, engaging in combat can be more of a hassle than anything else, and you're often better off avoiding enemies, which usually makes me question the quality of a game when I'm trying to get around what's arguably the main focus of the game mechanics. The platforming aspect is okay, nothing too special. You have obstacles to get around and there can be some tricky timing, which is a bit of fun. It is pretty annoying how often a fall can lead to an instant death, but if you're used to older games then this shouldn't be that big of a deal. However, there are a few too many cheap traps that are designed specifically to mess with the player. Here, I have to attack this wall to break it open, while being careful of this giant crusher. As soon as I attempt to go through, I get shot by this turret and knocked back, dying instantly. It is remarkably stupid. In fact, this room in particular is very obnoxious with how the turrets can kill you instantly by simply knocking you back into a pit. Now, it's not nearly as bad as it looks, but it does feel unnecessary and cheap. As you progress through the game, you collect new abilities such as a double jump and an air dash. These go a long way towards opening up your movement options and making the platforming a little bit more fun. But you don't get them until the latter half of the game, and by then it's kind of too little too late. You can collect money found scattered about, as well as dropped by enemies, and these are only used to buy extra lives, but it feels pointless because you'll always have way more money than you'll ever need without even trying by the time you come across the next merchant. But you know what? That's gotta be way better than having the price be too high and then you end up having to grind for money. If you search for secrets, then you can find health upgrades and some accessories that have minor changes to the gameplay. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the game, finding these secrets can be pretty obnoxious. For example, I walk into this room and figure that it's probably a point of no return. Well then, I walk the other way expecting to find the optional area, and after walking for a while, I figure that this is probably the mandatory path after all, and the room I left behind earlier is probably the one that holds the secret, so I end up walking back. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, but this is a pet peeve of mine in video games, especially for a game as slow and as easy to die in as this one. Not to mention that all the enemies respawn every time you leave and re-enter a room. It gets to a point that I don't even care about the secrets anymore and I just want to get the game over with, which probably isn't a good sign when I'm trying to speed run through it all out of boredom and frustration. Besides, all the secrets do is make the game easier. With enough health upgrades, you can start tanking hits from the bosses and the challenge is significantly lessened. But let's talk about the bosses. Some of these fights are insanely unforgiving, leave absolutely no room for error, and it feels incredibly unfair. At first. The third boss in particular felt impossible. But after several deaths and retries, I started to understand the pattern and had a much easier time. In that sense, I'm kind of willing to call them well designed. It is a bit of trial and error, but it's not like the bosses are necessarily hiding anything from you. You just need to be observant and try to react appropriately to the upcoming attacks. That being said, some of the bosses are way easier to read than others, and the balance is all over the place. The 3rd, 5th, and 8th bosses in particular are very difficult, while the rest vary greatly. The 9th boss, right before the very end, is one of the easiest ones. Speaking of which, the final level hardly has any enemies at all. It's mostly a bunch of platforming while avoiding these lasers. It's very jarring considering the game as a whole up to this point. My first run through the game took just under 2 hours, And that was on the hardest difficulty with many deaths and 2 continues after getting a game over, which sends you back to the start of the level. So, needless to say, the game is pretty dang short. As I mentioned earlier, there's a New Game Plus feature, and I figured, what the hell, let's see what this is all about. It turns out that there's hardly anything plus about this new game at all. You start over from the beginning, losing all your acquired abilities, accessories, and health upgrades. The only thing that changes is that every enemy now takes 1 extra hit to kill, which can actually make a pretty big difference in this game, and they've added this one new crossbow enemy who can be pretty annoying. Hilariously though, he shows up a grand total of like 4 or 5 times throughout the entire game. The difference he makes is extremely minimal, and he might as well have not been included at all. Despite the clear increase in difficulty, I actually managed to beat my second run through the game with far fewer deaths, no continues, and in a shorter time. It's definitely significantly easier once you already have an idea of what to expect, as most of the deaths will just come from trying to learn the boss behaviors. I'm really disappointed that there isn't more to New Game Plus. I was hoping to keep all of the abilities from the previous run and use them to open up some previously inaccessible passages earlier in the game to uncover more secrets. But there doesn't seem to be anything like that. It's just a linear, straightforward action platformer game, which, at the end of the day, that's not really so bad. I'm sure it sounds like I ragged on this game a lot, but honestly, I don't hate it so much. It is lacking in a lot of ways, but it still manages to work well enough for what it's going for. I did play through the whole thing twice, so I liked it that much at least. This actually kind of feels like some long-lost Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis game, but one with a rather low budget. It's lacking in a lot of ways, most of all with the enemy reactions, and some of the level design is just annoying. It's also, again, way the hell too short, and repeat playthroughs don't add nearly enough to the game. I'd say that $10 is maybe just enough of a fair price, although I still can't get over how short and simple the game is, but $15 is definitely pushing it. Still, if it's on a steep discount, and it looks interesting to you, then it's not such a bad game. Thanks for watching my review on Primal Light.